The letter fell from Anna Carter's hands before she even finished reading it. She stood in the middle of Grant Reed's kitchen, her boots planted on the rough-hewn floorboards, the morning sun cutting through the dusty window in a long gold stripe across the table where she had eaten breakfast every day for the past 3 months. 3 months of slowly, terrifyingly, undeniably falling in love with a man she had sworn she would never need. 3 months of telling herself she was fine, that she had always been fine alone, that solitude was not a wound but a choice. And now the letter sat at her feet with its dark past laid bare, its secrets spilled across the page like blood on dry earth, and she understood with horrible clarity that she had built her careful peace on a foundation that someone else had already decided to destroy. The handwriting belonged to a man named Silas Vance. She knew that name. She had heard it whispered at the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, heard it spoken low, and careful the way people spoke about rattlesnakes and flash floods. Silas Vance, who had once owned the land Grant Reed's ranch now stood on. Silas Vance, who had left the territory under circumstances no one quite wanted to explain. And according to the letter, Silas Vance was coming back. But that was not what had stolen the breath from Anna Carter's chest. What had stolen her breath was the single line near the bottom of the page, written in a different hand, darker ink, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "Tell Miss Carter to leave before I arrive, or I will give Rita reason to wish she never came." She did not hear Grant come in from the barn. She did not hear his boots on the steps, or the creak of the door, or the way he always cleared his throat slightly before he spoke. A small private habit she had learned to listen for the way other women listened for church bells. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell across the letter on the floor, and then across her face when he lifted his eyes to hers, and she watched the color drain out of him as he understood what she had found. "Anna," he said. That was all, just her name spoken like a confession. "How long," she said quietly, "have you known that someone was threatening me?" The silence between them was its own kind of betrayal. She had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1883 with nothing but a trunk, a sewing kit, and a reputation for being exceptionally difficult to love. That last part was her own assessment, offered without bitterness or self-pity, simply as a statement of observed fact the way a woman might note that the sky was going to rain. She had learned early that depending on people was a trap, and she had been careful ever since not to fall into it. Her mother had died of fever when Anna was 9, leaving her with a father who loved the bottle more than he loved his daughter, and a series of aunts and neighbors and church ladies who meant well but moved on. She had grown up in St. Louis, watching other girls form bonds she did not know how to form, attach themselves to families and futures and young men with steady hands and steady intentions. She had watched all of it from a careful distance and told herself the distance was her preference. She had become a seamstress because a needle and thread required nothing of her heart. She had become good at it because competence was the one currency that never lied to her. By the time she was 26, she had her own small room above a dress shop on Chestnut Street, a modest income, and the profound privacy she had always told herself she wanted. She was not unhappy. She was simply alone in the way that a well-sealed jar is alone, contained and sufficient, and giving nothing away. It was Nellie Marsh who sent her west. Nellie was the dress shop owner's daughter, a chattering, warm-hearted woman who worried about Anna the way some people worry about stray cats, with genuine affection and a certainty that the creature in question did not know what was good for it. Nellie had read about the homesteaders and ranchers of the Kansas plains who placed notices in eastern newspapers seeking capable women, housekeepers and cooks and sometimes wives, and she had clipped one such notice and left it on Anna's work table with a note that said simply, "You have nothing to lose and everything to find." Anna had almost thrown it away. She had picked it up and read it 3 times instead. Then she had written a letter to a post office box in Caldwell, Kansas, and a week later she had received a reply in a hand that was careful and unhurried, as if the man writing it had thought over each word before committing it to the page. Grant Reed had written that he owned a cattle ranch 12 miles outside of Caldwell. He had written that he needed a housekeeper and cook, that he had no family nearby, and that the ranch was large enough to require the kind of help he could not reasonably ask his ranch hands to provide. He had written that he understood if a woman from St. Louis found the prospect daunting, and that he would understand equally if she changed her mind. He had not written anything about himself that was not practical and relevant. He had not tried to charm her. He had stated facts and left space for her decision, and something about that particular quality of restraint had made Anna Carter write back the same day. She arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday morning in late March of 1883, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe rail line with her trunk and her sewing kit and approximately zero expectations. The town was exactly what she expected of a cattle town, wide and flat and smelling powerfully of livestock, with a main street that was more mud than road and a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they had arrived in the Kansas wind and simply stayed because they were too tired to keep moving. She had arranged with Grant Reed to be collected at the depot, and she stood outside the station in her plain gray traveling dress and waited. The wagon came from the east, a good solid farm wagon with a strong gray horse in the traces, and the man driving it was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older. Someone roughened into near anonymity by years of outdoor work, a man whose face had been so thoroughly shaped by sun and wind that it had become simply a landscape rather than a person. She had pictured someone she could comfortably regard as an employer and nothing more. Grant Reed was 32 years old, which she would learn later. In the moment she first saw him, she registered only that he was broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular steady gray of a sky just before it commits to clearing. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen years of honest use. He did not remove his hat when he greeted her because both his hands were occupied with the reins, but he nodded in a way that managed to convey respect without making a performance of it. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Reed," she said. He climbed down and lifted her trunk into the wagon bed with a single easy motion, and then he offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat, and she took it for the 3 seconds it required, and then released it, and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead, because she had felt something in that 3-second contact that she had absolutely no intention of investigating. They drove 12 miles without talking very much, which suited Anna entirely. He answered her practical questions about the ranch with practical answers. How many ranch hands? 3 full-time, 2 seasonal. How large was the house? 6 rooms, solid construction. What was expected of her? Cooking, cleaning, and management of the household supplies. Was there a garden? A small one that had been neglected. She was welcome to do with it as she pleased. She liked that last part. She was welcome to do with it as she pleased. It was the most generous thing anyone had offered her in years, not because it was large, but because it assumed she had opinions worth honoring. The ranch appeared on the horizon like something that had grown out of the earth itself, low and solid and belonging entirely to the landscape. There was a main house built from good timber, with a wide porch that faced south and caught the afternoon light. Behind it stood a large barn, several outbuildings, and beyond those, stretching to the horizon in every direction, the ranch land itself, gently rolling, green with early spring grass, and very, very quiet. Anna stepped down from the wagon and stood in the yard and felt the quiet land against her like something physical. She had grown up in the noise of St. Louis and worked for 6 years in the noise of a busy dress shop. She had told herself that people made noise because they were afraid of silence, because silence required a kind of internal honesty that company conveniently postponed. She had told herself she preferred silence. Standing in Grant Reed's yard on a Thursday in late March, with the wind moving through the new grass and a pair of meadowlarks calling from the fence line, She understood for the first time that there was a difference between the silence of absence and the silence of abundance. One was a room with nothing in it. The other was a room full of something too large to name. She told herself it was just the prairie. She told herself she would adjust. The house was clean, which surprised her. She had half expected the bachelor disorder she had heard about, unwashed dishes and boots in the parlor, and a kitchen that required archaeological excavation. Instead, the house was sparse but orderly, the dishes washed and stacked, the floors swept, the furniture modest and sensible. Grant Reed, she would come to understand, was a man who found disorder physically uncomfortable, not because of vanity, but because disorder meant something was being neglected, and he was constitutionally opposed to neglecting things in his care. That included the garden, which had not been neglected out of laziness but out of plain lack of time. She found it behind the house, a 20 by 30-foot rectangle of dark Kansas soil that had been turned over but left unplanted, and she stood at its edge the first afternoon and felt something move in her chest that she chose not to examine closely, because it felt dangerously like hope. She planted seeds that week. She found the neglected tools in the barn and asked one of the ranch hands, a young man named Hector who spoke with a slight Mexican accent and had a face permanently creased from squinting into the sun, whether he knew anything about the water source for the garden. Hector showed her the hand pump behind the kitchen and said that Mr. Reed had been meaning to extend it to the garden plot but had not gotten around to it. She thanked Hector and decided that she would manage with buckets, and Hector looked at her with frank admiration and said nothing else. She had been there 2 weeks when Grant Reed first did something that cracked the careful surface of her self-sufficiency, though she would not admit it for weeks afterward. She was carrying water from the pump to the garden in the early evening, 2 full buckets balanced from a wooden yoke she had found in the barn and adapted to her height. The yoke was not perfectly balanced for her, and the second bucket was pulling awkward, and she was managing it through sheer stubbornness, which was a strategy that had served her adequately for 26 years. She heard his boots on the path behind her and kept walking, because she was not going to ask for help and was not going to stop simply because someone was watching. He came up alongside her and without a word lifted the right bucket from the yoke and carried it himself, not taking over, not making a production of it, just reducing the load by exactly half and walking beside her without comment, as if they had agreed to this arrangement long ago. She said, "I can manage." He said, "I know you can." And he kept walking beside her, and she kept walking, and they watered the garden together in the long Kansas evening light and did not speak much. And when they were done, he carried both buckets back to the pump and refilled them for the morning and set them in the barn where they would be shaded. And she watched him do all of that and felt the sealed jar of herself develop an infinitesimally small crack. She told herself it was nothing. The weeks moved. She learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had learned the rhythms of the dress shop, through careful observation and adaptation and the quiet pride of competence. She learned that Grant Reed ate his breakfast at 5:30 every morning without exception, that he took his coffee black but would add a small amount of molasses on days when the work ahead was particularly heavy, which she found oddly endearing. She learned that he read in the evenings, sitting in the ladderback chair nearest the lamp with whatever book he had borrowed or purchased in Caldwell, and that he read slowly and carefully, as if he intended to keep everything. She learned that he had built the ranch himself, or very nearly. He had come to Kansas in 1877 at the age of 26 with a small inheritance and a purchased parcel of land and a great deal of what she could only describe as determined, quiet stubbornness, and he had spent 6 years turning raw prairie into something that worked. The original small cabin was now one of the outbuildings. The main house had been built in 1880, timber hauled from 50 miles north. The cattle herd was modest but healthy. The land was productive. She learned all of this in pieces, because Grant Reed did not volunteer information about himself the way some people do, as a kind of currency to purchase intimacy. He answered direct questions directly. He occasionally said something that opened a small window into his interior life, and then he moved on, as if he had not noticed the window was there. She found this deeply familiar because she operated the same way. It was Hector who told her about Silas Vance, and he told her in the casual way that people share information they assume you already have. He mentioned the name one afternoon in early May while she was working in the garden, and he was repairing the fence along the garden's eastern edge, talking about the history of the land, the original claimants and disputes, and the long, complicated process by which land in Kansas changed hands. He mentioned that the southern 40 acres of the Reed Ranch had once been claimed by a man named Silas Vance, who had abandoned it in 1879 under what Hector described with studied neutrality as cloudy circumstances. She asked what that meant, and Hector paused in his hammering and looked at the fence post and said that Vance had been suspected of running stolen cattle through the territory and that there had been some unpleasantness involving a local family, but that nothing had ever been formally proven, and that Vance had simply left one day, and the land had eventually been legally incorporated into the Reed parcel. He said it the way people in the West said difficult things, with a flattening of affect that was not indifference but the particular brand of practical acceptance that the frontier required. She filed the information away and thought nothing more of it. She was too busy with other things. The garden was coming up beautifully, rows of beans and squash and tomatoes, and a small border of sunflowers along the southern edge that she had planted on an impulse she could not entirely explain. The kitchen was running smoothly. She had reorganized the household supplies and established a system with the nearest town merchant, a methodical man named Abner Cole who ran the general store, so that orders were placed and fulfilled on a reliable schedule. And she was spending evenings on the porch. That was new. She had not intended it to become a habit, but the first time she had stayed on the porch after supper to watch the Kansas sunset, she had found that Grant Reed was there too, sitting in the wooden chair at the far end with his coffee, and neither of them had suggested the other leave. And eventually the sunset had become the dark and the dark had become the stars, and they had talked quietly about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. The way conversations go when two private people discover that the other person is safe. She learned about his sister in Missouri, Mary, who had married a farmer and had 3 children and wrote long, cheerful letters that Grant clearly treasured and was slightly embarrassed to admit he treasured. She learned that he had tried to read law before deciding the West suited him better, and that he still read legal texts sometimes, purely for the pleasure of the argument. She learned that he loved cattle not in any sentimental way, but in the practical way of a man who understood and respected what an animal could do, who found the management of a herd to be a kind of large and satisfying puzzle. She told him things, too, which shocked her more than anything. She told him about the dress shop and the sewing. She told him about St. Louis, the noise and the crowds, and the way she had always felt slightly invisible in a city that contained so many people, invisible and simultaneously overexposed, as if being surrounded by people made her more alone rather than less. She did not tell him about her father, not yet. But she told him about Nellie Marsh and the clipped newspaper notice, and he laughed when she described Nellie's note, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh outright, a low, warm sound that she felt rather than just heard. She was falling in love with Grant Reed, and she knew it, and she kept trying to stop. She tried to maintain professional distance. She tried to be efficient and competent and unremarkable, the excellent housekeeper who did her job and occupied the corner of the household that had been designated for her. She tried to stop noticing the way he moved, careful and deliberate, nothing wasted, nothing performed. She tried to stop noticing that he listened when she spoke with a quality of attention she had never experienced before, as if what she said was worth holding in his mind and turning over and examining. She told herself she was fine. She had always been fine alone. The solitude of this ranch was just another form of the solitude she had always preferred. She told herself this on mornings when she woke to the sound of his boots in the kitchen and felt something in her chest light. She told herself this on evenings when their conversation on the porch stretched past the first hour and neither of them could seem to find a natural stopping point. She told herself this late at night in her room, which was at the back of the house and looked out over the garden, and she could see his lamp still burning in the study, and she lay in her narrow bed and told herself she was perfectly fine. The crack in the jar was becoming a fracture. It was May when she first understood clearly that he felt it too, and not from anything he said or did that was forward or improper. He was a man of genuine restraint in that regard, and she had understood from the beginning that he was not the kind of man who would make her situation uncomfortable by pressing for something she had not offered. But she had noticed the way he sometimes stopped and was very still when she came into the room, the way a man might stand very still when a bird lands nearby that he does not want to frighten away. She noticed that when their hands brushed at the supper table passing dishes, he did not withdraw quickly, but he did not lean into the contact either. He simply held the moment and then moved on, as if practicing a patience that cost him something. She noticed these things and did not remark on them, and she went about her work, and the fracture spread, and the garden grew, and the evenings on the porch accumulated, and June came to the Kansas plains with long hot days and warm nights full of cricket sound and the smell of dry grass, and Anna Carter stood in the middle of what she had told herself was simply a job and felt it become something she had no name for yet. The name arrived on a Tuesday in mid-June when she was in the garden at twilight, tying up the tomato plants with strips of cloth, and Grant came out of the barn with his hands still dusty and his shirt damp with the day's work, and he stopped at the garden gate and watched her for a moment and then said, "That garden is the best thing that's happened to this land in 10 years." She looked up from the tomato plant and he was looking not at the garden but at her, and he seemed to realize it a fraction of a second after she did, and neither of them looked away, and the name arrived in Anna Carter's chest fully formed and final and absolutely terrifying. She was in love with this man. She was completely, irrevocably, dangerously in love with this steady, private, careful man who had given her a garden and a porch and the extraordinary luxury of being listened to. And she had absolutely no idea what to do with that information because she had spent 26 years being fine alone and she did not know how to stop. She said, "The beans are coming in well." He said, "They are." And they stood in the twilight with the weight of it between them, enormous and unspoken, and the evening went on, and dinner came, and the porch, and the stars, and she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and understood with cold clarity that her very carefully constructed preference for solitude had just been revealed as the lie it had always been. She had told herself she was fine with solitude. His ranch, and the man who had built it, had made solitude feel like a mistake. But then it was July and the letter arrived. She had only found it because she was replacing the soap in the study. It was not sealed. It was sitting open on the corner of his desk, and she would not have read it except that the envelope had slid sideways and she had straightened it, and the letter itself had unfolded in her hands, and she had read the first line before she could stop herself, and then she had read all of it, and the letter had fallen from her hands. Now Grant stood in the doorway of the study with the color gone from his face, and the letter lay between them on the floor, and the morning light was making its golden stripe across the table where they had eaten breakfast every day for 3 months. "How long?" she said again, because he had not answered. "How long have you known that someone was threatening me?" He crossed the room and picked up the letter, not to hide it but to hold it the way a man holds something he has been carrying alone for too long. 3 weeks, he said. "The first letter came 3 weeks ago." The word first struck her like something physical. "There have been others. 2 others. They were not addressed to you. They were addressed to me. I did not think." He stopped and reordered himself. "I thought I could handle it before it reached you." That was not your decision to make. No, he said, it wasn't. The honesty of that disarmed her slightly. She had been ready for him to defend himself, to offer the reasonable but infuriating explanation that he had been protecting her, as if she were something fragile that required protecting rather than a woman who had managed her own survival for 26 years without assistance. His simple agreement with her assessment took the edge off her anger without eliminating it. "Tell me everything," she said. He sat down at the desk, and she sat in the chair across from it, the chair she sometimes used when she was reviewing household accounts, and he told her. Silas Vance had sent word from Texas, where he had been living since leaving Kansas in 1879. He wanted the southern 40 acres back. Not through legal means, because legally the land had been properly transferred and he had no claim, but through the kind of pressure that men like Vance preferred, which was the pressure of fear. He had written first to Grant, making vague suggestions about what might happen to the ranch and the people on it if his demands were not met. When Grant had written back dismissing the threat, Vance had escalated. The third letter, the one Anna had found, had been written partly by Vance and partly by someone else, someone who had clearly done reconnaissance on the situation, because whoever had written that second part of the letter knew Anna's name and knew she was at the ranch and knew, with the particular intimacy of observed knowledge, that she mattered to Grant. That was the trap. That was the hidden motive. Vance had found leverage. "He thinks that threatening me will make you give him what he wants," Anna said. "Yes." "And threatening the land directly didn't work." "No." She looked at Grant Reed sitting behind his desk with the letter in his hands, and the weight of this forced choice visible in the lines of his face, and she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that he had been carrying this alone because he was the kind of man who carried things alone, who had built everything he owned through individual effort, and considered it his personal responsibility to solve problems before they became other people's burdens. She understood that this quality, which she had admired, was also the quality that had led him to make a decision about her safety without consulting her. And she understood with a clarity that surprised her that the particular force of her anger came not from the threat itself but from the fear underneath it, the fear that he had looked at the situation and judged her worth protecting rather than worth trusting. She understood one more thing. The letter writer had said, "Tell Miss Carter to leave before I arrive, or I will give Reed a reason to wish she never came." Grant had not told her. He had kept the secret. And the only reason to keep that particular secret was if the prospect of her leaving was something he found worse than the threat itself. She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't tell me to leave," she said. His jaw tightened. "No, even though that would have removed me from the threat." "Yes." The word came out rough and low. "Why?" He set the letter down on the desk very carefully, as if it were something explosive, which in a way it was. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she saw in his face the same thing she had been seeing for weeks without acknowledging, the same thing that had been building in her chest since March, since a gray horse and a wagon at the depot, and a 3-second handshake that had changed the temperature of her blood. "Because," he said, and then he stopped, and he was the most inarticulate she had ever seen him, which was itself astonishing because he was a precise and careful speaker. He said, "Because this ranch without you in it is not a place I find myself willing to consider." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Anna Carter had ever stood in. She breathed. She made herself think clearly, which was difficult because her chest was doing something enormous and complicated. She said, "That is an extraordinary thing to say." "I know it," he said. "We have not spoken of anything like this." "No," he said. "I have been trying to be appropriate." "I see." She looked at her hands in her lap, her practical seamstress's hands, roughened now by garden work and housekeeping, and she thought about all the evenings on the porch and all the meals shared, and all the times she had lain in her narrow bed and told herself she was fine alone. She thought about the garden full of things she had planted because something in her had recognized this place as a place worth putting down roots. She said, "I have also been trying to be appropriate." Grant Reed looked at her with a careful, wondering stillness. "That has not," she said, and her voice was steady, which impressed her, "been entirely easy." A great deal happened in his face in the next several seconds. A careful, controlled man encountering relief of a magnitude he had not quite allowed himself to anticipate, and she watched it and felt the fracture in the sealed jar of herself become something more like an opening, a door rather than a break. Then she said, "But we still have a very serious problem." He exhaled slowly. "Yes. Tell me the rest of it, everything you know about Vance." So he did. Silas Vance was not a man who made idle threats, Grant explained. He had a history in this territory of following through on what he promised, which was what made his departure in 1879 puzzling, because it had seemed unlike him to abandon a dispute without resolution. Grant had inquired, after the first letter arrived, and had learned from a contact in Dodge City that Vance had spent the years since 1879 in Texas, where he had been involved in various legal and illegal cattle dealings, and had apparently accumulated both money and associates of the kind who did work for money, without moral objection. He was traveling north through Indian Territory, based on the intelligence Grant had been able to gather, and would likely reach the Kansas border within 2 to 3 weeks. Anna sat with all of this and thought about it the way she thought about difficult sewing problems, examining it from every angle, looking for the place where the seam could hold. "You said his claim is legally without merit." "Completely. I have the deed and the transfer documentation. The county record is clear." "Then this is entirely about intimidation." "Yes. And if you show him the threat cannot work, he loses his leverage," Grant said carefully. "That is the theory. Men like Vance don't always respond to logic." "No," she agreed, "but they respond to calculations. If the cost of pressing forward is higher than the gain, they stop." She looked at him directly. "Have you written to the county sheriff?" "I have," he said. "Sheriff Alderton in Caldwell is aware of the situation. He has limited jurisdiction on the trail Vance is using, but he has been notified." "And your ranch hands, Hector and the others?" "They know enough to be alert." "I haven't given them full detail." "Tell them the full detail," she said. "These men work your land. They have a right to know what is coming and the ability to make an informed choice about whether to stay." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between admiration and the particular look of a man who has been shown a better way of thinking. "You're right," he said. "I'll speak to them today." "Good." She stood up and smoothed her apron, a gesture of composure that was partly genuine and partly performed, because her hands wanted to do something with themselves while her heart was still conducting its considerable private business. "And tonight on the porch you are going to speak plainly to me about what you said earlier, and I am going to speak plainly back, and we are going to handle that matter with the same directness that we are handling this one." She walked out of the study with her chin level and her stride even, and only when she was in the kitchen with the door closed did she lean against the wall for a moment and put both hands over her mouth and breathe. She was terrified, not of Silas Vance, who was a problem with a logical structure and therefore could be addressed with logic. She was terrified of the thing happening in her own chest, the enormous opening, because she had spent 26 years keeping that particular door closed, and she had been certain she could keep it closed indefinitely. And Grant Reed had spent 3 months quietly making that certainty impossible. Hector and the other 2 full-time ranch hands, a broad-shouldered older man named Walt who had worked cattle since before Grant was born, and a younger man named Pedro who was Walt's nephew and learning the trade, were gathered in the barn that afternoon, and Grant told them everything. Anna stood at the barn door and listened and watched their faces. Hector's expression went from alert to resolved in about 4 seconds. Walt's went from resolved to grim in about 2, the face of an older man who had encountered threats before and had opinions about how to meet them. Pedro looked young and slightly scared, but set his jaw with a determination that she respected. Walt said, "So this Vance thinks he can ride in here and make trouble," Grant said. He appears to think so, Walt said. I worked cattle in this territory since '68, and I have not once let a man run me off land that was legally held, and that's not changing now. You've got my word. Hector and Pedro both spoke similarly, and Anna felt something shift in the room, the particular quality of people who have decided together to hold a line, and it was different from the isolated resolve of one person deciding alone. It was stronger. It had texture. She understood, standing in the barn door in the July heat, that this was what she had been protecting herself from all her life. Not the pain of depending on people, which was real and had its cost, but the terrifying, irreversible warmth of belonging somewhere that belonged back. The evening came and supper was finished and the dishes were washed, and the ranch settled into its night sounds, and Anna Carter and Grant Reed sat on the south porch as they had sat for months, except that the space between their chairs was charged with everything they had said and not said that morning, and the prairie wind moved through the grass in the long fading light, and after a while Grant said, "You told me to speak plainly." "I did," she said. He turned his chair slightly so he was facing her more directly, which was as much of a formal gesture as this man made. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the second week of April, when you adapted a barn yoke to carry water to a garden and refused any assistance, and I thought that was the most remarkable combination of stubbornness and competence I had ever seen in a person." She looked at him steadily, though her heart was conducting an entire orchestra. "The second week of April," she said, "that is very specific. I was trying to note the moment precisely so I could not later talk myself out of it," she breathed. "I do not know the exact date for me," she said, "but I know it was before May." She paused. "I have been trying very hard not to be in love with you." "I know," he said. "I could see it. Was it obvious?" "Only because I was watching very carefully." She looked out over the darkening prairie for a moment, at the first stars appearing above the grass line, and she thought about 26 years of being fine alone, and about sealed jars and broken open doors and gardens planted in earth that did not belong to her yet, but that she had treated as if it might someday, and she said, "I am afraid." "So am I," he said immediately, and she looked at him sharply because she had not expected that. "Of what?" she asked. "That you will decide," he said carefully, "that this is not what you want, that the life here, the land, the isolation from everything you knew, that it's too much of a cost for what I can offer." He said it very evenly, as if he had rehearsed the evenness. "I am not a man with a great deal to offer beyond the ranch and my word and what I feel, and I am aware those are not guaranteed to be sufficient." She stared at him. She stared at this man who had built a ranch from raw prairie and managed a cattle operation and dealt with threats with quiet competence and read law for the pleasure of the argument, who was currently sitting across from her and telling her in his careful way that he was afraid she would find him insufficient. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She said, "Grant." "Yes." "You gave me a garden." He blinked. "You walked beside me with a water bucket without making it a favor. You listened to me. You told me I was welcome to do as I pleased, which is something no one in my entire life has said to me, and I felt it as if someone had opened a window in a room I had been breathing recycled air in for years." Her voice was steady, which was impressive given the magnitude of what was moving through her. "You are not insufficient. You are the most sufficient person I have ever encountered, and that has been the problem, because I had a very well-established system for being alone that required everyone to be more or less disappointing, and you have been entirely impossible to fit into that system." He was very still in the way she had come to know, the way he went still when something landed with weight. "Anna," he said, and the way he said her name was entirely different from how he had said it that morning in the study, different from the careful, employed way he had said it for months. It was full of something she felt in her whole body. "Yes," she said, answering the question he had not quite asked yet. He reached across the space between their chairs and she placed her hand in his, and neither of them moved for a while, and the night deepened around them, and the stars spread across the Kansas sky in their full summer abundance, And Anna Carter sat in Grant Reed's hand and felt her carefully constructed solitude become, fully and finally, the mistake it had always secretly been. The next 2 weeks were not simple or serene, because Silas Vance was still coming, and the threat was real, and Grant and Anna and the ranch hands spent those weeks in a state of productive alertness. Grant rode to Caldwell and met with Sheriff Alderton, a shrewd and weathered man in his 50s, who had dealt with enough territory disputes to know the difference between idle bluster and genuine danger. Alderton agreed with Grant's assessment that Vance was unlikely to engage in direct violence against a legally documented property, but that the possibility of intimidation and sabotage was real. Anna wrote to the county land office in Wichita requesting a certified copy of the deed transfer documentation, which arrived by the end of the first week. She organized all relevant papers into a clear and documented packet, indexed in the careful, orderly way she organized everything, because if Vance arrived claiming some mudded version of ownership, she intended for the legal reality to be immediately and undeniably accessible. She was not afraid of Silas Vance. She had encountered difficult men before, men who mistook a quiet woman for an easy target, and she had learned young that the most effective response to that particular miscalculation was to simply refuse to behave as predicted. She was occupied during those 2 weeks with something far more engrossing than Silas Vance, which was the extraordinary experience of being loved by Grant Reed with the restriction lifted. He did not become demonstrative or showy. He was not a man for whom that would have been authentic, and she would not have found it authentic in any case. But the careful restraint between them was gone, replaced by a different kind of care, one that was intimate in a way she had no prior experience of and found breathtaking in its particulars. He brought her coffee in the garden in the morning without being asked, setting it on the fence post nearest where she was working. He told her things from his reading, small pieces of something he had found interesting, offered with the assumption that she would find it interesting too, and she always did. On the evening of the third day, after supper, he stood with her at the kitchen window and pointed out a family of ground squirrels that had established a colony near the garden's east edge, and they stood together at the window for 10 minutes watching the squirrels with identical expressions of entertained affection. And then they looked at each other and both smiled at exactly the same moment, and she understood that this was the most intimate experience of her life. He asked her, on a quiet afternoon when they were both on the porch and the heat was heavy, and the cattle were standing still in the far field, whether she had thought about her future, by which he meant did she intend eventually to return east or to remain in the west. She looked at the garden, which was producing abundantly now, green and full and spilling over its borders. She looked at the prairie beyond the fence, which she had learned to read the way she had once read the moods of a busy city street, the color of the grass telling you about water, the behavior of the birds telling you about weather, the particular stillness of a hot afternoon telling you that the evening would likely be clear. She said, "I planted sunflowers on an impulse. I think that tells me something about my intentions." He looked at the sunflowers along the southern garden edge, tall and turned toward the afternoon sun. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Carter, Anna," he looked at her directly. "I know you have built your life on your own terms and that you guard your independence carefully and that you have very good reasons for all of that. I'm not going to ask you to trade those reasons for something that frightens you." He paused. "I am, however, going to ask you to consider whether what is frightening is the thing itself or simply the prospect of wanting it." It was the most precisely accurate thing anyone had ever said to her. She looked at him for a long time. "Both," she said finally. "It is both." "Fair," he said. "I need more time," she said. "Not because I am uncertain of what I feel. I am not uncertain. I am," she searched for the word. "Newly arrived," she said. At this, "I have not been here before." "Neither have I," he said. "We can be newly arrived together." Something in her chest gave way completely, like ice in a spring river, the last locked piece releasing into current, and she breathed in and breathed out and said, "All right. Together." Silas Vance arrived on a Thursday morning in late July, which was coincidentally the same day of the week Anna had arrived in Caldwell in March, a fact she noted with a certain grim irony. She saw the dust of approaching riders from the kitchen window, and she went to the study door and told Grant, who came out onto the porch and stood with the stillness of a man who has been expecting something for long enough that its arrival is almost a relief. There were three of them. Vance was in the middle, a tall man in his mid-40s with a sunburned neck and the kind of eyes that made calculations rather than observations. The two men with him had the look of hired hands who were hired for things other than cattle. They pulled up in the yard and Vance looked at the ranch with an expression Anna could only describe as possessive, the look of a man reviewing something he has already decided belongs to him. He looked at Grant. He looked at Anna. His gaze on her was the particular gaze of a man who has gathered intelligence and is now confirming it, and she met it without flinching and watched him note that. "Reed," he said. "Vance," Grant said. "Heard you've been running a prosperous operation." "The land is good," Grant said. "It rewards decent work." "I remember this land," Vance said. "I had plans for it." "You abandoned your claim to it 4 years ago," Grant said. "The county record reflects that." "I have the documentation inside if you'd like to review it." Vance smiled, which was not a warm expression. "I'm not here about documents." "No," Grant agreed. "You're here about the letters." Something moved in Vance's face. He had not expected that directness, Anna could see. He had expected either aggression or anxiety, and he was getting neither. Grant said, "You are welcome to make your argument legally and formally in the county courthouse in Wichita. I have the documentation to support my position, and I am confident in the outcome. If that is not your preference, I would ask you to ride back the way you came." Vance looked at Anna again. "Is this woman your housekeeper or your answer to the question, Reed? Because threatening her worked in the letter and I'd hate to have it not work now." Anna said, before Grant could speak, "I read your letter, Mr. Vance. Both hands of it. I found the second part particularly interesting because it suggested that you believed my presence here gave you power over this negotiation, and I want to be very clear that it does not." Vance looked at her with the slightly surprised expression of a man who has underestimated someone and is catching up. "Is that so?" "That is exactly so. Mr. Reed's land is legally his. Your claim is without legal foundation. You have traveled a considerable distance to threaten a woman and intimidate a man, and neither the woman nor the man is intimidated. I would suggest that this represents a poor return on your investment of time." One of Vance's hired men shifted in his saddle. The other one looked at Walt, who was leaning against the barn door with the easy posture of a man who was not planning to move, but who had thought quite carefully about what happened if he did. Hector was visible near the corral, and Pedro was at the far corner of the house. Sheriff Alderton's deputy, a capable young man named Collins who had ridden out that morning after receiving word from Grant that Vance had been spotted on the Caldwell Road, was visible at the end of the lane. Vance looked at the deputy. He looked at Walt. He looked at Anna, and something in his calculation adjusted, the way a man's face changes when he counts the room and finds the count unfavorable. His hidden motive had relied on fear, and there was no fear available in this yard. His leverage had relied on isolation, and the isolation had been replaced with something considerably more solid. He looked at Grant for a long moment, the two men conducting the silent arithmetic of a confrontation that has reached its conclusion. "This isn't finished," Vance said. "In Wichita," Grant said, "it can be, legally, fully, and on record. That offer stands." Vance pulled his horse around and rode out. His two hired men followed, and the dust of them moved south down the lane and thinned and was gone, and the yard was left with the sound of the wind in the grass and the distant calling of meadowlarks. Anna realized she had been holding her shoulders very rigid, and she let them go, and Grant stepped off the porch and came to where she was standing in the yard, and he looked at her and said, "That was extraordinarily well done." I have dealt with difficult customers, she said. The principle is the same. You take away the thing they think gives them power, and then you give them a door they can walk through with some dignity. Most of them will take the door. He looked at her with that full, steady regard that she had stopped trying to deflect. Will he pursue it legally? She asked. No, Grant said. He knows he would lose. He'll find another place to put his resentments. He paused. I'll ride to Wichita next week and file a formal record of this visit with the county, just to ensure there's documentation. Good, she said. I'll have the packet ready. They stood in the yard in the late July sun, and Deputy Collins rode over and got a brief account of the exchange and confirmed that he would report back to Sheriff Alderton, and then he rode back to town. Hector and Walt and Pedro came out from their various positions, and there was a brief collective exhale among the men that had the quality of relief managed with masculine restraint. And Walt said something dry about the anticlimax of well-prepared confrontations, and there was quiet laughter. Anna looked at Grant and he looked at her and she thought, this is also what I was afraid of. Not the threat, but this, the afterward. The standing in a yard with people who stayed and did not leave, and the understanding that she was one of them now, and that the thing she had called solitude was simply what happened before this, and it had been, exactly as she had finally admitted to herself, a mistake. The following weeks were the warmest and most expansive Anna Carter had ever lived in. Grant rode to Wichita and filed the documentation, and returned with news that Vance had already been spotted heading south toward Indian Territory again, which was the expected outcome of his calculations not going his way. The threat receded, and the ranch returned to its rhythms, but the rhythms were different now, fuller, because Anna and Grant were no longer maintaining the careful professional distance that had cost them both considerable effort. She told him about her father on a Sunday afternoon in August when they were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, and the heat outside was thick and still, and the house was cool in its thick-timbered way. She had not planned to tell him, but she found herself talking about St. Louis and the dress shop, and the particular quality of growing up in a household where love was unreliable. And once she had started, she found she did not want to stop, because he was listening with his full attention, and there was no trace of pity in his face, only understanding, and understanding was so much better than pity. She told him about her mother's death, and about her father, and about the aunts and the neighbors and the church ladies, and the careful distance she had maintained from all of them, and about the dress shop and the sewing and the small room on Chestnut Street, and about Nellie Marsh's note, "You have nothing to lose and everything to find." She told him all of it, and when she was done, she felt emptied in the specific way that comes from setting down a weight you have been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying it. He said, "I am glad you came west," she said. "I am glad Nellie Marsh is a persistent woman." He said, "I would like to write to Nellie Marsh and thank her." She laughed, and it surprised her, the free sound of it, and she felt him watching her laugh with the expression she had learned to recognize in him, quiet and warm and profoundly attentive, as if storing something. He told her more about himself, too, things she had not heard yet, about the years in Missouri before Kansas, about learning cattle work from a neighbor and discovering that the outdoor life was the only indoor of his mind that made sense, about the sister Mary and their childhood, a life that had been ordinary and good, with parents who were present and consistent, and had both died within a year of each other when Grant was 23, leaving him their modest estate and a bone-deep understanding that the things you built yourself were the things you trusted most. He said he had been lonely in the years before the ranch was established enough to require regular help. He said lonely in the same careful neutral tone he used for most emotional information, presenting the fact without dramatizing it, and she understood that he had experienced the same sealed jar isolation she had, the same carefully constructed sufficiency, built from a different origin but resulting in the same provisional peace. "We are," she said, "a well-matched pair of people who had both decided not to need anyone." "And then," he said. "And then," she agreed. He asked her, On the last evening of August, sitting on the south porch with the moon coming up enormous and golden over the eastern horizon, if she would marry him. He asked it simply and directly, without kneeling or elaborate performance, which was entirely consistent with who he was, and which she found more moving than any elaborate performance could have been. He said he wanted to make a life with her, on this land, with the garden and the porch in the evenings, and that he understood what he was asking her to give up and what she would be choosing instead, and that the choice was entirely hers. She looked at the moon for a moment. She looked at the prairie. She looked at the garden, where the sunflowers had gone to seed now and were swaying heavy-headed in the evening breeze, and she thought about everything she had told herself she was fine without. She said, yes. She said it clearly and without hesitation, and she meant it with every part of herself that had been carefully sealed and was now, permanently and with full consent, open. He took her hand. They sat in the moonlight without needing to say anything else for a while, and it was the quietest, most complete silence Anna Carter had ever been inside of. They married in October of 1883 in a modest ceremony at the Caldwell Methodist Church. Anna wore her best dress, which she had altered and trimmed with a length of good blue ribbon that she had purchased from Abner Cole's general store. Grant wore a dark coat that he had pressed carefully, and which was slightly too formal for him, which she found entirely endearing. Hector and Walt and Pedro were present. Sheriff Alderton attended as a guest. Nellie Marsh had been written to and had sent back a letter so full of delighted exclamation that Anna had read it twice and kept it in her sewing kit. There was no minister in Caldwell at the time, the Methodist circuit rider being absent for the season, so a justice of the peace named Mr. Beaumont conducted the ceremony with brisk efficiency and a small private smile that suggested he had attended enough grudging frontier marriages to appreciate a clearly willing one. Grant said his words with the direct simplicity of everything he said, looking at Anna throughout rather than at the document or the justice. Anna said hers with an evenness of voice she was proud of, given that her entire interior was engaged in something close to flight. When it was over and they were standing in the weak October sunlight outside the church, Walt produced a bottle of bourbon from somewhere in his coat, and there were small glass measures poured, and a toast offered with the brevity and feeling appropriate to men who express themselves through action rather than speech. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the same wagon and the same gray horse, 12 miles of Kansas prairie in the autumn light, and Anna looked at the land moving past and felt it differently than she had in March. In March it had been enormous and foreign, something to be assessed and adapted to. Now it was simply home, in the complete and settled way that home means when you have never been entirely sure you would find one. The ranch was quiet when they arrived, the hands having tactfully removed themselves to various other activities for the evening. The house was warm because someone had kept the stove going. On the kitchen table there was a plate of dried apple pastries, clearly Hector's work, covered with a cloth with a small note that said simply, "Congratulations to Mr. and Mrs. Reed." Anna stood in the kitchen and read the note, and felt something she recognized only after a moment as pure happiness, uncomplicated and entire. Grant came up behind her and read the note over her shoulder and said, "Hector makes excellent pastry. I suspect he has been practicing." She laughed and turned around, and he was right there, and they were married, and this was their kitchen, and she put her hands flat on his chest and looked up at him and said, "I spent 26 years being fine alone." "I know," he said, his hands coming up to her arms, warm and steady. "I was wrong," she said. "I was completely, fundamentally wrong." "So was I," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we were wrong together, and now we are right together, and that seems like a much better arrangement." He kissed her for the first time properly, which they had not quite managed before, being both of them rather careful people who required the full formal permission of commitment before allowing themselves that particular openness, and it was warm and certain, and tasted like the end of a very long silence. The winter came to the Kansas plains with its customary indifference to human plans. arriving in November with a sharp northerly wind that stripped the last of the leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek and drove the cattle into the wind-sheltered low ground south of the barn. Anna spent the winter learning the ranch's cold weather rhythms, which were different from its warm weather ones and equally absorbing. She learned to read the sky for blizzards, a skill Walt had that she was determined to acquire, and she learned the particular satisfaction of a warm, well-stocked house when the temperature outside was doing things she chose not to contemplate. She and Grant spent the winter evenings as they had spent the autumn ones, reading and talking and sharing the deep domestic quiet of two people who have found in each other an antidote to the loneliness they had both spent years managing rather than curing. She altered and improved her sewing skills through the winter, making practical things for the house and for the ranch hands, who received her work with a gratitude that was touching in its straightforwardness. She wrote to Nellie Marsh regularly and received Nellie's long, chattering letters with genuine delight. She wrote to Mary, Grant's sister in Missouri, and received in return a warm and generous letter from a woman who seemed to feel nothing but relief that her brother had found someone, and who included a pressed flower from her garden that she said was from the same variety their mother had grown, which Anna pressed between the pages of her household account book. Grant rode to Wichita in December to confirm officially that Silas Vance had not pursued any legal action, which was confirmed. The chapter was closed formally and completely, and Anna felt the last of its shadow lift from the ranch. Spring came back to Kansas in March of 1884, 1 year from Anna's arrival. The garden, which she had put to bed carefully in October with a thick mulching of dried grass and cow manure, was the first thing she checked, and it responded to her examination with the green assertiveness of well-tended earth ready to produce. She was carrying a child by then. She had suspected it since January and been certain since February, and she had told Grant on a cold, clear morning in late February when he had come in from the early chores and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and an expression he later described as simultaneously terrified and delighted. He sat down across from her and looked at her face and said, "Tell me." She told him. The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long, which was how long it took Grant Reed to organize a feeling of the magnitude of the one he was apparently having. Then he stood up and came around the table, and she stood up and he held her, and his hands on her back were the steadiest thing she had ever felt. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I believe so. I feel unreliable in the mornings, but otherwise well." He said, "We will get Dr. Henning from Caldwell." She said, "Not yet. I want to be past the early weeks, but soon." He said, "Whatever you need." She said, "What I need is for you to not look at me as if I might break, because I assure you I am not fragile." He said, "I know you are not fragile. I am the one who is potentially fragile." She laughed until she had to sit back down, and he sat beside her and held her hand on the table, and they sat in the February kitchen with the pale winter light through the window and the warmth of the stove and the future between them, enormous and specific and entirely theirs. The baby was a boy, born in the early autumn of 1884 on a crisp September morning when the light was low and golden, and the meadowlarks were calling from the fence line. Dr. Henning from Caldwell was present. Grant was present, insisting on remaining in the house despite Dr. Henning's suggestion that the yard was perfectly comfortable, and Anna had not objected, because she had found during the preceding months that Grant's proximity had become as necessary as weather, something she arranged her interior life around. They named him Thomas William Reed. Thomas for no particular named reason except that it settled on them both immediately and felt right. William for Grant's father. Thomas was a healthy and opinionated infant, who from the very first days demonstrated a character that was clearly going to require negotiation. He was loud when he wanted something, which was frequently, and he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's particular expression of focused assessment when he was examining something new, which meant that life in the ranch house in his first weeks was loud and sleepless and deeply, incandescently wonderful. Hector and Walt and Pedro received the arrival of Thomas Reed with the particular warmth of men who spend their working lives in physical and often isolated labor, and who find the presence of a young life on the property to be genuinely fortifying. Walt made a small wooden horse, carved carefully and sanded to smoothness, which he presented to Grant with an economy of words that did not disguise his feeling. Hector brought dried apple pastries, which he seemed to regard as the appropriate response to significant events. Pedro, who was youngest of the three and perhaps most unguarded in his expressions, simply stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at baby Thomas with an expression of uncomplicated joy. Mary and her husband came from Missouri in October to meet the baby, traveling by rail to Caldwell, and arriving with a wagon load of their cheerful energy and 3 children who immediately discovered the ranch as an adventure landscape and had to be periodically retrieved from various barns and fence posts. Mary was warm and immediate and embraced Anna with the frank affection of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome and was not pretending otherwise. "He has been different in his letters since March of last year," Mary told Anna, the two of them sitting on the south porch while the children were being supervised by a long-suffering Pedro in the yard. "Not different in what he wrote, because he never writes very much, different in the quality of how he wrote it, as if the weight he always carried had been adjusted somehow." She looked at Anna directly. "I knew someone had arrived before he told me." Anna considered this. "He is not an easy man to know quickly," she said. "No," Mary agreed. "He never has been. It costs him something to let people in. I always hoped he would find someone worth the cost." She smiled. "He clearly did." Anna looked at the ranch yard, at the barn and the outbuildings, and the garden in its autumn abundance, at the prairie beyond the fence lying golden in the October light. A year and a half since she had arrived in a gray traveling dress with a trunk and a sewing kit, and approximately 0 expectations. She thought about the sealed jar and the fracture and the door and the opening, and about sunflowers planted on impulse and a water yoke adapted from barn equipment and a 3-second handshake at a train depot in March. She said, "So did I." The years moved as good years do, with the sense of abundance that comes when the life you are living is the one you intended, or discovered you intended, which is perhaps the more honest way of saying it. The ranch grew in modest, careful increments that suited Grant's character and the land's capacity. A new section of fence was built in the spring of 1885, extending the grazing range to the east. A better water system was installed that year too, properly extending the pump to the garden at last, which delighted Anna in a way that was disproportionate to the practical improvement, and which Grant clearly found endearing. Thomas was walking by the time the water pump reached the garden, staggering around the yard on legs that had more ambition than coordination, and he immediately developed a passionate interest in the garden that was slightly destructive and entirely charming. Anna put him to work with small tasks, giving him a trowel and a designated patch of earth, which occupied him happily and productively for lengths of time that surprised her. She had a second pregnancy in 1886, which produced a daughter they named Clara Rose. Clara arrived in June and was the opposite of Thomas in temperament, peaceful and observant from the first, lying in her blanket and watching the world with a calm that made Thomas, now nearly 2 and extremely kinetic, look like a natural force in comparison. Anna held Clara on the porch in the evenings and watched Thomas being chased around the yard by Hector with an energy that suggested Hector enjoyed it approximately as much as Thomas did, and she felt the fullness of the life she was in as something physical, something she breathed. Grant, in the evenings, read to Thomas. This had become a habit when Thomas was barely old enough to follow the sound of words, beginning with simple things and expanding as Thomas grew, and the image of the two of them in the lamplight, Thomas tucked against his father's side with the absolute trust of a child who has never needed to question where safety lives, was one that Anna returned to privately when she thought about what the alternative of her careful solitude had actually cost her. How close she had come to choosing the distance over the arrival. She had told herself she was fine with solitude. She knew now, with the completeness of someone who has lived the comparison, what that fine had actually been. It had been adequate, it had been managed. It had been the survival strategy of a woman who had not yet found the thing worth risking for. It had never been fine. It had been waiting, disguised as preference. Grant said something once late in the evening of a summer night when the children were sleeping and they were on the porch in the old familiar way that she kept afterward in the most private room of her heart. He said, "I think the ranch knew before I did. It always felt like it was waiting for something, like it was more than I could fill by myself." She said, "Land doesn't wait." He said, "No, but I did." She looked at him in the summer dark and understood that he was right, that they had both been waiting in their careful parallel solitudes for the thing that made solitude an error rather than a choice, and that the ranch had simply been the place where the error became visible. She said, "I am glad the error was obvious eventually." He said, "I am glad you are difficult to discourage." She said, "I prefer the word persistent." He said, "I know." And he was smiling in the dark, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the prairie went on around them in every direction, enormous and patient in theirs. In 1887 they had a third child, another son, whom they named James after no one in particular, simply because it fit him, and James arrived in the world with a howl of such magnificent authority that Walt, standing in the yard at some distance, remarked that the boy had opinions. James grew to justify this assessment. He was loud and determined, and had his mother's stubbornness, and his father's patience in alternating measure, which made for a child of considerable complexity and considerable entertainment. With 3 children and the expanding demands of the ranch, it became necessary to engage additional help in the house. Anna hired a woman from Caldwell named Margaret, a competent and good-natured widow in her 40s who worked 3 days a week, and who proved to be exactly the kind of practical, non-intrusive assistance that allowed Anna to continue managing the household without being managed by it. Margaret and Anna developed a working relationship of mutual professional respect that was comfortable and uncomplicated, and the household ran with the smooth efficiency of 2 competent women who understood each other's capabilities. Anna also resumed her sewing in a more deliberate way, turning the back parlor into a workroom where she maintained her skills and occasionally took commissions from women in Caldwell who wanted fine work that the general store's dressmaker did not quite achieve. It was not necessary income. The ranch was prosperous enough by the late 1880s that they were comfortable. But the sewing was hers in a way that she valued precisely because it predated everything. It was the skill she had built alone, in the years before Grant Reed and the ranch and the garden and the children, and maintaining it felt like honoring the woman she had been, who had built what she could from what she had and had been, in her limited way, fine. The land around Caldwell changed through the late 1880s as the cattle drives that had made the town famous began to wind down. The rail lines pushed further west, and the great trail drives that had come up from Texas through the 1870s and early 1880s diminished and eventually ceased, and Caldwell transitioned from a cattle shipping town to an agricultural community, which brought different people and different economics. Grant adapted to these changes with the same careful practicality he brought to everything, diversifying the ranch operations to include more crop production alongside the cattle, reading the agricultural journals that came by post, and making adjustments to the land management that proved sound. Anna watched him manage these changes and felt, as she often did, a deep and specific admiration that was different from the romantic love she also felt, more like the admiration you feel for a skilled craftsman, for the quality of careful competence applied with consistent integrity over time. She told him so once, trying to put the distinction into words, and he looked at her with the expression she loved, that quiet full attention, and said that he regarded her the same way, that the thing he felt for her was not only love but something like reverence for the quality of how she moved through the world. She had thought, at 26, that she understood herself completely. She had catalogued her preferences and her limitations and her damages, and had assembled from those materials the most self-sufficient life she could manage. She had been competent and contained, and she had told herself the container was a preference rather than a wound. What she had not known, and could not have known, was that self-knowledge acquired in isolation is necessarily incomplete. You cannot know what you need until you encounter it. You cannot know what loneliness actually is until you have experienced its opposite. You cannot know that the silence you have been living in is empty until you find the silence that is full. Grant Reed, and the ranch he had built from raw Kansas prairie, and the garden he had given her to do with as she pleased, had shown her the difference. She was 31 in 1888, and the ranch had been her home for 5 years, and she could not, making a serious effort, entirely reconstruct the texture of the life she had lived before it. Not because it was painful to remember, but because this life had become so densely and specifically hers that the previous one felt like a draft, something written before the final version arrived. One evening in the autumn of 1888, with Thomas 4 years old and Clara 2 and James 14 months, and all three of them finally asleep in a silence that had the quality of earned peace, she and Grant sat on the porch in the cool September air and watched the stars appear over the Kansas plain, and Grant said, "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him, surprised by the directness, and then she thought about it seriously because he asked it seriously, the way he asked everything, with genuine wanting to know rather than wanting to be reassured. She said, "Yes, I am comprehensively, specifically, astonishingly happy." She paused. "I did not know that this was available. This exact quality of it. I thought happiness was a thing that happened occasionally when circumstances aligned. I did not know it could be a condition." He said, "It is for me. It has been since you came." She said, "I was a stranger who arrived with a sewing kit." He said, "You arrived and the ranch made sense in a way it hadn't before." She thought about that for a while. She thought about the solitude she had defended for so long, the sealed jar quiet of her life in St. Louis, the small room and the dress shop, and the adequate peace she had built from available materials. She thought about standing in Grant Reed's yard in March of 1883 and feeling the quiet of the place against her like something physical, and telling herself it was just the prairie. It had not been just the prairie. It had been the place where she was meant to set down roots, and the man who had been waiting in it, just as privately, just as carefully, just as thoroughly mistaken about his own capacity for solitude. She said, "I told myself I was fine with solitude." He said, "I know." So did I. She looked at the ranch around them, the solid house, the barn with its warm yellow light, the garden in its autumn close, the dark prairie beyond the fence running to the horizon. She said, "It turns out I was wrong about that. This place made solitude feel like a mistake." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good." Just the one word, low and warm, and she understood everything in it. Because Grant Reed said everything in single words sometimes, the way a good structural wall says everything about the quality of its building through its simple fact of standing. She leaned her head against his shoulder and his arm came around her, and the stars continued their ancient patient business overhead, and the Kansas night settled into its deep particular quiet, and Anna Carter, who was Anna Reed now and had been for 5 years and intended to be for as many more as the world would give her, sat in that quiet and felt it for exactly what it was. Not the silence of absence, not the contained stillness of a sealed jar, not the managed peace of a woman who had decided that needing no one was the same as being safe. It was the silence of everything she needed within reach, and the breathing of 3 small children inside the house, and the man she loved beside her, and the garden she had planted on impulse, and the sunflowers that had gone to seed 3 years running and come back on their own because good roots, once established, did not require replanting. She had told herself she was fine with solitude. The ranch had made that very clear and entirely permanent mistake, and she had never been more wrong about anything. And she had never been more grateful. The years continued and continued to be good, in the specific way of lives that have found their shape. Thomas grew into a serious, capable boy who was his father's shadow in the fields from the time he could walk steadily, and who read the way Grant read, slowly and carefully, and as if intending to keep everything. Clara grew into a girl of considerable quiet humor and her mother's precision, who learned to sew at Anna's knee, and had opinions about everything that she expressed with a serenity that made the opinions land harder. James grew into exactly the person the authority of his arrival had promised, decisive and loud and warm-hearted, with a laugh that could be heard across the yard. They added a room to the house in 1890 when a 4th child, another boy named Robert, arrived, and the existing space required renegotiation. Robert was mild and sunny, and adored his siblings with an uncritical warmth that smoothed the rougher edges of their interactions, and he grew up as the particular kind of child who makes a household run better simply by being present and content in it. Walt retired from full ranch work in the early 1890s, his years showing themselves in his joints, but he remained on the property in a reduced capacity, managing the lighter maintenance and repair work that suited his experience without requiring his former physical output. He had a small room in the bunkhouse that was entirely his, and he ate supper at the main house 3 times a week, a habit that had begun practically and continued as the genuine social arrangement it had become. He taught Thomas and James to carve wood in the evenings, with the patience of a man who has acquired patience through years rather than temperament. Hector, who was 10 years younger than Walt, remained an essential part of the ranch operation through all these years, his role expanding as the ranch did. He was family in everything except the formal nomenclature, and Anna had stopped regarding him any other way. He was Thomas's favorite person for approximately 2 years when Thomas was between 6 and 8, a phase Grant observed with a mild and entirely unself-conscious pleasure that Anna found characteristic and endearing. Pedro grew into a skilled cattleman, and eventually left to establish his own small operation east of Caldwell, which the Reed family regarded with the pride appropriate to watching something you had a hand in forming go out and work on its own. The ranch flourished. The land was good and they worked it well, and they were not wealthy in any significant sense, but they were solid, which was the word Grant used, and which Anna thought was exactly right, solid like the house he had built, like the fence posts Walt had set, like the foundation Anna had discovered she was capable of building her life on when she finally found the right ground. In 1895, 12 years after Anna Carter had stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe rail line in Caldwell, Kansas with her trunk and her sewing kit and approximately 0 expectations, she received a letter from Nellie Marsh. Nellie was married now, to a newspaper editor in St. Louis and had children of her own and wrote with the same cheerful loquacity she had always had. She was writing to say she was traveling west with her husband on a press business trip and wondered if she might impose upon Anna for a visit. Anna read the letter at the kitchen table and looked up at Grant, who was having his morning coffee, and said, "Nellie Marsh is coming." Grant said, "I'll tell Hector to prepare the guest room." She wrote back that day with directions and a sincere welcome, and a feeling in her chest that was partly delighted anticipation and partly something more private, the desire to show Nellie Marsh the thing she had found when she had taken Nellie's note seriously. You have nothing to lose and everything to find. Nellie had been right in a way neither of them had quite known to expect. Nellie arrived in June and was exactly as Anna remembered, warm and chattering and interested in everything, and she walked through the ranch house with the frank curiosity of someone who had spent years wondering about this place. And she stood in the kitchen and looked at the children visible through the window in the yard, and she looked at Grant, and she looked at Anna, and she said, "Oh, Anna." "Oh, this is everything." Anna said, "It is." Nellie said, "You were always so certain you were fine alone. I never believed it for a moment." Anna looked through the window at Thomas doing something responsible with a fence post, at Clara reading in the shade of the cottonwood, at James chasing Robert around the yard with the energetic invention of a boy who viewed his siblings as his best available entertainment. She looked at Grant's hat visible at the edge of the barn, the shape of him moving through his day with the characteristic steadiness she had spent 12 years loving. She said, "I believed it, right up until I didn't," Nellie said. "And then?" Anna said, "And then I was very glad that the ranch made a better argument than I did." They sat on the south porch in the June evening, all four of them, Nellie and her husband and Anna and Grant, and the children came in from the yard as the light fell, and Thomas helped his father with the last of the evening chores, and Clara sat beside her mother with a book, and James fell asleep on the porch steps with the decisiveness of a child who has been in complete motion all day. And the Kansas night came up around them, and the stars arrived in their abundance, and the meadowlarks called their last calls of the day from the fence line. Nellie's husband, a quiet man named Franklin who liked Grant immediately in the way that quiet men recognize each other, said that the prairie was different from what he had expected. He had expected something bleak, and he had found something vast, and the distinction mattered. Grant said the prairie rewarded attention. He said most things did. Anna, listening, thought about what the prairie had asked of her when she stood in this yard for the first time in March of 1883 in her gray traveling dress. It had asked nothing of her. It had simply been there, in its enormous patient way, and she had looked at it and felt the silence against her and been offered, without any obligation, the choice to stay. She had chosen to stay because of a job, initially, and then because of a garden, and then because of a water bucket carried without being asked, and then because of evenings on the porch and conversations that opened small windows and a man who listened as if what she said was worth keeping. And then because she was in love, which was the simplest and most terrifying and most complete reason. And now because this was home, which was the only reason that mattered in the end, the one that contained all the others. She was 38 years old. She had been Anna Reed for 12 years. She had 4 children and a garden that she had been tending with the same deliberate care for 12 years, and that had rewarded her with 12 years of abundance. And she had a ranch that had been built by a man who understood that the things you built yourself were the things you trusted. And she was one of those things now. Something he had built with her rather than for her, which was the only way she would have allowed it. She had told herself for 26 years that she was fine with solitude. She had believed it with the conviction of someone who has never been offered the alternative in a form they could recognize as real. And then she had arrived in this yard and found this man and planted these sunflowers, and the solitude had revealed itself for what it actually was, not a preference, not a choice, not a strength, but a very long, very detailed, very convincing mistake. She sat on her south porch in the June evening with her daughter asleep against her shoulder and her sleeping youngest son at the top of the porch steps, and the sound of her husband and her eldest son coming in from the barn, and Nellie Marsh beside her full of warmth and the vindication of having been right about something important, and the Kansas stars coming up one by one above the prairie, and she breathed in the night air and felt the fullness of it. The complete and irreversible and very beautiful mistake of having believed she could ever have been fine without any of this. She had not been fine. She had been waiting, and everything she had been waiting for was here.